GeForce 256. Nvidia releases a chip and calls it the world's first GPU. Marketing? Sure, but also kind of true. Before this, your graphics card was just pushing pixels while your CPU did all the heavy math. GeForce 256 introduced hardware, transform, and lighting, meaning the card itself could now handle 3D geometry instead of begging the CPU for help. Clock speed, 120 MHz. Memory, 32 MB. That's less RAM than a single modern PNG screenshot. It ran about $250 at launch, roughly $470 today, and powered exactly one killer app, Quake 3, looking slightly less blocky. The catch? Almost nothing supported hardware TNL yet, so most games ignored it completely. Still, every GPU since owes its DNA to this one. If GPUs were cars, this was the first one with an actual engine instead of a guy pedaling underneath. GeForce 8800 GTX. Jump to 2006, and Nvidia does something wild. It throws out the old rendering pipeline entirely. Before this, GPUs had separate fixed hardware for vertices and pixels. If a game needed more pixel power, your unused vertex hardware just sat there. Nvidia's fix? Unified shaders. One flexible pool of processing cores that could do either job on demand. 128 stream processors, 768 megabytes of memory, and enough horsepower to make Crysis merely difficult instead of physically impossible. This card cost $599, about $920 today, and PC gamers paid it happily, because for the first time, a single GPU could run every game at max settings without sweating. The downside? It needed 2 power connectors and ran hot enough to double as a space heater in December. But this was the architecture that every GPU since has followed. Fixed pipelines were dead. Flexibility, won.
GeForce GTX 680 Kepler. 2012 brought a philosophy shift. Stop chasing raw power, start chasing power efficiency. Nvidia's Kepler architecture prioritized performance per watt. And suddenly, GPUs weren't just fast, they were sippers instead of guzzlers. The GTX 680 launched at $499, delivered roughly double the performance of the previous generation on similar power draw, and introduced GPU boost, automatically overclocking itself when there was thermal headroom to spare. Translation, your card got smarter about its own limits instead of just running flat out and melting. This was also the generation that made 1080p gaming completely trivial and 1440p genuinely viable for enthusiasts. The catch? AMD was still trading blows here, and buying Team Green wasn't yet the default assumption it is today. GeForce GTX 1080 Pascal. This is the generation that made PC gaming feel unstoppable again. Built on a smaller, more efficient manufacturing process, the GTX 1080 delivered performance that made the previous flagship look embarrassing at a lower price. $599 launch, 8 GB of GDDR5X memory, and clock speeds pushing past 1.7 GHz out of the box. VR headsets had just arrived, and Pascal was the first architecture that could actually drive them without giving you motion sickness from dropped frames. This was also peak Just Buy Nvidia era. AMD's competing cards ran hotter, drew more power, and lagged in efficiency. A GTX 1080 could still comfortably run 1080p Ultra settings years later. Buy one used today, and honestly, it'll still boot most esports titles just fine.
RTX 2080 Turing. 2018 is where Nvidia bet big on a feature almost nobody asked for, ray tracing. Real-time lighting simulation that calculates how light actually bounces, instead of faking shadows with old tricks. Sounds incredible on paper. In practice, early ray tracing tanked frame rates so hard that turning it on felt like punishment. The RTX 2080 launched at $699, a steep jump, and the first wave of RTX-supported games numbered in the single digits. Turing also introduced DLSS, AI upscaling rendering, that used a dedicated tensor core to fake extra resolution. Early DLSS looked blurry and unconvincing. Nobody knew it yet, but this clunky first attempt would become the most important feature in modern GPUs. At launch, though, you were paying a premium for a tech demo. The catch? Buying future-proofing nobody could actually use yet. RTX 3080 Ampere. 2020 fixed almost everything Turing fumbled. Ray tracing performance roughly doubled. DLSS 2.0 actually looked better than native resolution in some games, which sounds impossible until you see it running side by side. $699 launch price, but here's the catch that defined this entire generation. You could never actually buy one. Crypto mining demand plus a global chip shortage meant scalpers listed $699 cards for $1,500 plus, and stock vanished in seconds flat. For nearly 2 years, MSRP became a fictional number, like a restaurant's market price seafood. If you managed to snag one at retail, you basically won a lottery. Performance-wise, this generation made 4K gaming genuinely realistic for the first time. Getting one at a fair price, genuinely not realistic at all. RTX 40 series, Ada Lovelace. 2022 brought raw power back, alongside a price tag that made people flinch. The flagship pushed past $1,600 at launch, more than double the previous flagship's original price. DLSS 3 added frame generation, letting the AI invent entirely new frames instead of just upscaling existing ones. A genuinely wild trick, though purists argued it wasn't real performance. Power draw climbed too, with some cards needing a new 12-pin connector that promptly gained a reputation for melting if it wasn't seated perfectly. Efficiency did improve generation over generation, but so did the assumption that a flagship GPU should cost more than an entire budget gaming PC used to.
RTX 50 series, which brings us to now. AI upscaling isn't a gimmick anymore. It's the default assumption baked into how these cards are marketed and benchmarked. Frame generation has multiplied further, memory bandwidth keeps climbing, and the line between rendered and AI-generated frame is basically gone. The catch is the same one this whole series keeps repeating. The top-tier card is genuinely impressive and genuinely priced for people who don't check their bank balance first.